So today I'm going to take you over my tiny Sony Fx3 cinema rig. And you lot know what it's like, mate. As soon as you stick the word cinema in front of rig, your camera just instantly turns into a cinema camera. So let's take you over all the components of this rig, tell you why each individual part of this rig is set up the way that it is, just to make my life easier as a shooter. And also just to be, inspiring to want to pick up and shoot with. Because at the end of the day, you want your rig to actually inspire you to want to go and shoot and also allow you to get the best results. No component of this rig is sponsored in any way, but this video does have a sponsor, and that is Lexar. So for me, when it comes to rigging up my camera, I want my rig to be a few different things. I want it to be nice and small. I want it to be nice and minimal so we haven't got loads of different cables knocking about everywhere. I want to have a really good monitor. I want it to be mega sturdy so we've got like no flappy bits hanging off it, no noises when you give it a good shake. I want the power to pretty much be coming from one nice big source. I also want it to be heavy enough to the point where when you're operating the camera, you're not getting them micro jitters, because I personally don't like to use IBIS when I'm shooting. Part of the cinematic look for me personally is not having IBIS and having that nice natural handheld look. And for you to shoot without having your IBIS on, you pretty much need a camera that has got a little bit of weight to it. But I also don't want it to be too heavy that I'm going to turn into a 70-year-old by the time I'm 40. 3 points of contact. So contact number 1, right hand. Contact number 2, hand on the lens. I also use that hand to change my exposure with my ND filter and obviously pull focus every now and then. And the battery at the back acts as that 3rd point of contact, so I can get a really nice handheld shot from this rig. And weirdly enough, I've noticed in some BTS shots that I've been using my chin as a 4th point of contact on my handle, which is really weird. I didn't even realise I was doing it until I saw the BTS. And now when I think about it, when I'm shooting, sometimes I just whack my chin on the handle and it makes such a big difference. If you want to use your chin, great, but I don't really recommend it. So first off, obviously we've got the Sony Fx3. Been absolutely loving this camera for a very, very long time. And I think now that I've really got to grips with S-Log 3, like, I'm not even going to lie to you, I reckon I've only really got to grips with editing and color grading S-Log 3 to the best of my abilities probably within the last 6 months. And I've been in this game for quite a while. So I'm constantly learning, constantly changing, just like you lot. I'm never going to say I'm better than anyone else or that I'm ever at a destination. I'm always learning as a filmmaker, as a cinematographer, and as a color grader. And I just think learning to expose your S-Log 3 footage is going to make such a big difference when it comes to just the overall image quality that you get out of S-Log 3. If you learn to expose correctly, if you learn how to color grade S-Log 3 correctly, that is going to have a massive advantage on the quality of your image out of your Sony camera. So the cage is the Tilter cage, and I just love Tilter. I just think they're a really cool brand. They look the nuts. I love the branding, and I just think it makes your camera look a bit sick. So the main reason that I needed or wanted a cage on this thing, because we've obviously got lots of mounting points on the Fx3, the main reason was I wanted 2 mounting holes on the bottom of the camera. Now, Sony, you already know this, but we definitely need 2 mounting holes on the bottom of any cinema rig. So the Fx3 Mark II, or the next iteration of the cinema line, please make sure that we got 2 mounting holes on the bottom, because I've obviously mounted a L bracket on the back here to mount my large Sony MPF 970 battery. Now, this battery is the Backstar Pro 10,500 milliamp hour 970 battery. Now it's got a USB out which I run into my Sony Fx3 so that I can get continuous power delivery to the camera, and then I can get my DC port out to dummy battery to go onto my monitor, which I'll get onto in a minute. Now this battery I've had for about 3 years, and it's probably been the best battery I've ever bought in my life, and I can basically run this entire rig off of 1 or 2 of these batteries and it will last a full day of shooting. Now the battery is mounted to a small rig NPF plate, which I've just mounted to this L bracket. Now this L bracket was just a really random cheap L bracket from a company called Camolo. That L bracket also has an Arca Swiss plate on the bottom of it, so I can basically mount that Arca Swiss plate onto tripods, onto my gimbal, whatever it is that has an Arca Swiss plate on it. So next up we have the top handle, and I absolutely love this top handle. It's just the right size, it's not too big, and I just love how minimalistic and kind of skeleton-like it is. Now don't get me wrong, it hasn't got the most amount amount of grip in the world, but I pretty much picked this 100% for aesthetic reasons. I'm not even going to lie. I just love the way it looks. And if I'm dead honest, I actually do really like the way that it feels. It feels really, really nice in the hand. And this rig is actually really well balanced. It's a tiny bit front heavy depending on what lens we've got on there. But overall, it's a pretty damn balanced rig. Now that top handle has a NATO rail so that I can easily slide it on and off of the top of my tilter rig. Now annoyingly, the tilter rig actually has a cold shoe gap in the top of the NATO rail on the top of it. So I do have to mount that top handle ever so slightly off to the right hand side. So it's just off center of the lens, but it's way more center in the center of the actual camera. So I've got no problem with that at all. We have a small rig monitor mount. I like the fact that the monitor comes a little bit lower and we basically lower our center of gravity on the rig. I don't really like having a really tall rig. Having like mad tall rigs doesn't really feel too balanced for me. So I wanted to try and get the monitor nice and close down to the lens, and this thing balances really, really nicely, especially with that monitor mount that brings the monitor a little bit closer to the camera. So let's talk about SD cards and the sponsor of today's video, which is Lexar. So Lexar have just released 3 new SD cards into their Silver series. You've got the Silver SD card, you've got the Silver Plus SD card, and also the Silver Plus Micro SD card. I've been using the Silver Plus SD card across my FX3 and also my A7S over the last few weeks. I'm also shooting this video on the Silver Plus SD card. So on the Silver Plus SD card, you can get a write speed of up to 150 megabytes a second, so you can comfortably shoot in XAVC-S up to 4K 60, which pretty much covers 99% of my needs. I'm rarely shooting 120 frames these days, and I very rarely shoot in XAVC-I because I want to try and keep my media space nice and low. And also, my computer can more than handle the slightly more compressed codec of XAVC-S. I've also been using the Silver Plus micro SD card on my Mavic 3 Pro in Italy, literally like last week, and it's worked a dream. Lexar have been around forever and they're pretty much like a household name when it comes to SD cards, so it's nice to know that you've got a bit of confidence behind the brand. So if you're looking for an SD card with great performance but also doesn't break the bank, you ain't got to spend a ton of money, I'll leave a link in my description for the Lexar Silver series of cards. They really are a great SD card for the price. Next up, we've got the monitor, and in my opinion, probably the most important part of the rig. This is the Portkeys LH5P Mark II. It's a 2200 nit monitor, which is really nice and bright, more than usable in exterior locations, so it gets mega bright. It is very power hungry, but the two things I absolutely love about this monitor is the fact that it's mega bright, and also you can have wireless connection to your Sony camera. So I can actually link my monitor to my camera, and I can have all of my camera controls that I can manually adjust on the monitor with the touch screen. Instead of having to go back to the camera and using the camera monitor, I can actually just do everything on the monitor itself, so I can see all of my different settings. I can change my white balance, iris, shutter speed, my ISO, and I can tell when I'm recording. It's just so nice to have that confidence of seeing a really nice layout on the monitor itself. And when it comes to the lens, I'm using the original Sony 24-70 2.8 G Master. I actually love the weight of this lens. It's a little bit heavier than the Mark II, it's a little bit bigger, a bit beefier, because I just feel like it's a nicer lens to operate. Obviously, every different shoot, every different project requires a different lens to have a different look depending on what you're going for in the video. But for me, this lens pretty much hits 99% of most scenarios I'm in. 2.8 is definitely fast enough. It's definitely enough bokeh. And then I get all of that range from 24 to 70. Lenses are changing all the time depending on the project, but this thing pretty much stays on this camera for most of my projects. And in terms of the ND, I've got the Peter McKinnon Polar Pro variable ND filter. And when it comes to the cables, I've basically just bongo tied them together. That's the HDMI and the dummy battery. I can even stick this on my gimbal just by changing out the size of the battery on the back. So I can basically just whack a smaller MPF on the back of this rig and it just jumps straight on the gimbal. So I can go from handheld, on the gimbal, off the gimbal so easily. And I don't even want to take off my monitor when it comes to shooting on a gimbal, because I've just noticed the heavier my gimbal rig, the smoother my shots. I've always been about lowering the size, lowering the weight of your camera, but as I've just been in this game a little bit longer and over time, I'm like, I don't really care that much about how light it is. I obviously want a light backpack when I'm traveling and when I'm running about with my gear on my back, but when I'm shooting, I'll just stick the camera down for when I'm not shooting, and I want my camera to be nice and weighty. Now, onto the parts of the rig that I would like to improve ever so slightly. The battery. Now, I would love if this battery had a USB-C in and out, which I know that small rig do and also newer do. So I'm going to look into potentially getting one of those batteries. Also, I know that the small rig one also has an LED display, so it literally gives you the percentage of battery that's left, which is good because at the end of the day, I want to have a USB-C for one. I want it to make sure that it can charge for the USB-C, because then I don't have to lug about these silly MPF battery chargers which just get in the way and they're mega slow. And finally, the L bracket on the bottom, I would love if it had an Arca Swiss quick release so that I could basically just take it on and off via that Arca Swiss that's on the bottom of the tilter cage. Now, small rig already do one for V-mount batteries, but I would love to see an Arca Swiss quick release plate that you can have an L bracket on the back, and you can obviously mount a Sony MPF battery, because I much prefer these batteries over V-mounts. They're just way too big for me, and I love the profile of this rig. It's perfect. It's definitely important to have a rig that really suits your needs. Don't just go out and make a rig based on someone else's recommendation like mine, because this rig is perfect for me. It might not be perfect for you. There's absolutely no doubt about it. This rig was partly inspired by Caleb Pike's tiny cinema camera video, which I've actually added a lot of components which you'll notice from that. So a big shout out to Caleb. And if you haven't checked out Caleb's Cinebat that he does for the Sony FX3, definitely go and check that out, because it's actually something that I'd like to play with at some point. So I'll leave all the links in the description for anything I've spoken about, and go and check out Lexar's Silver series of SD cards, because they're absolutely banging for the price. Anyway, you lot, thanks so much for watching, and as always, mate, I'll be catching you lot in the next one, mate. Bosh!